All right, so today we're diving into the Annunciation, that incredible moment when an angel appears to Mary. But we're going to look at it through a really specific lens, a sermon by Glenn Barry Shankty. And his whole argument is that this one single event is the ultimate proof against this idea we sometimes have of a distant, hands-off God. Let's dig into how he builds that case.
So, the sermon kicks off by hitting on a feeling I think we can all relate to, right? You look at the news, you look at the world, maybe even just your own life, and it's easy to feel like things are a total mess. And you start to wonder, is God even able to fix this? Does he want to? And that's the exact tension the sermon wants to tackle head on.
And here's the sermon's big counterpunch. The speaker basically says, if you think the Bible portrays a hands-off God, you're missing the whole point, especially in this story. No, it paints a picture of a God who is constantly, deliberately, and powerfully active in the world.
So the way the sermon frames it, you've got these two competing views of the world. On one hand, you've got what he calls the world's view, and he's got this kind of cheeky summary for it from a Clint Eastwood movie, Every Which Way But Loose. A world of chaos, of randomness. But the biblical view? Totally different. It says God is always active. Nothing is just an accident.
Okay, so how do you even begin to prove that? Well, the first layer of evidence he presents is all about historical timing. The argument he makes is that this whole announcement didn't just happen out of the blue. It happened at a moment in history that was, you might say, perfectly set up.
And to really drive this point home, the sermon points right to this verse from the Apostle Paul. And that phrase right there, the fullness of time, that's the key. It doesn't just mean, when the time was right. It suggests a moment that was deliberately guided and matured for this exact purpose. And you can see here what that fullness of time actually looked like on the ground. First, you had Alexander the Great spreading the Greek language everywhere, giving the known world a common tongue, a huge deal for communication. Then, the Roman Empire comes along and establishes the famous Pax Romana, a time of peace, plus they built all these roads and had a unified legal system. The sermon's point, all these historical forces created the perfect infrastructure for a new, world-changing message to spread like wildfire.
Okay, so after looking at history, the next piece of evidence comes straight from Scripture. The argument here is that this wasn't just about perfect timing in the moment. It was the fulfillment of a promise that was ancient, showing that God is active not just for a season, but across millennia.
Now get this. We're talking about a promise made 1,000 years before any of this happened. As the sermon points out, our promises, they kind of have a sell-by date. We can't guarantee something for 10 years, let alone 1,000. The sheer scale of this timeline is meant to shout that this isn't a human plan.
And this is the promise itself, given to King David. It's about an heir, an offspring, whose kingdom will last forever. That's just a massive, seemingly impossible prophecy.
But here's where things get really interesting, and the sermon just draws this incredible contrast. That huge promise of an eternal throne, where is it fulfilled? Not in a palace with a prince decked out in gold. It's fulfilled through Joseph. Sure, a descendant of David, but now just a poor carpenter from a town nobody had ever heard of. The whole point he's making is that the humility of it all points away from human power and directly toward a divine plan.
All right, so this brings us to the third and maybe the most crucial piece of the argument. It's not about when this happened, or even what happened, but how it all went down. And the method God uses is presented as just openly, undeniably supernatural. You see, the story gives us not one, but two situations that are just biologically impossible, happening at the same time. First, there's Mary's relative, Elizabeth. She's old, she's been barren her whole life, and suddenly she's 6 months pregnant. And then you have Mary herself, a young virgin. The sermon frames these two events like bookends, designed to show us that what's happening here is completely outside the normal laws of nature.
And this leads to a pretty direct challenge to how we think today. What he's basically saying is, look, you can't just take the supernatural stuff out of this story and expect it to hold up. The virgin birth isn't presented as some nice metaphor, it's the foundational claim. It's the keystone that the whole building rests on.
So after laying out this huge case, looking at history, scripture, the supernatural, the sermon kind of pivots. It shifts from this big picture view of God's action in the world to what all of this means for you and me, for the individual. And it all centers on one word: grace.
So what exactly is grace, according to this sermon? Well, he boils it down to something so simple it's almost shocking. It's not about a trade or a transaction. It's a one-way street. The principle is, God gives, and that's the deal. That's it. That's the whole thing.
And you can see the contrast right here. It's huge. Our whole world runs on transactions. It's a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of system. You work, you get paid. You pay, you get a service. But grace, as it's presented here, is a completely different operating system. It's not about what you earn or what you deserve. It's just about receiving something that is freely, totally given.
So naturally, when Mary hears this, frankly impossible plan, she asks a completely logical, very human question. She's thinking in terms of cause and effect, the world she lives in, and what the angel is telling her has no natural cause. Her question is really our question, right? It's our rational minds trying to get a grip on something that's beyond our rules.
And check out the angel's answer. It's not a biology lesson, right? It doesn't try to explain the science. The answer just bypasses the natural order completely. It's not about how it works, but who is doing the work. The mechanism is just the direct, raw power of God.
And then comes this, the ultimate bottom line. And the sermon presents this as more than just a comforting phrase for Mary. It's framed as the fundamental principle of reality from God's point of view. It's the answer to her problem, to Elizabeth's problem, and, the sermon argues, to any and every human impossibility.
So when you put it all together, the perfect timing, the ancient promise, the impossible method, this idea of grace, it all builds to one single, absolutely mind-blowing conclusion. And that is the theological reality of the incarnation.
The speaker summarizes it with this incredible turnaround. He says, the charge that Jesus' enemies threw at him was, "You, a mere man, are making yourself out to be God." But the sermon says the truth of the gospel is the exact reverse of that. It's Jesus saying, "I am God and I have made myself a man."
And that right there, that completely lopsided exchange, that's the final point of the whole sermon. The idea that God, the one who sustains the universe, became one of us. He entered our mess, our world, our weakness. And for what reason? So that we could become one of His. The explainer really leaves us with this massive thought. What does it actually mean when the Creator willingly becomes part of His own creation?